You know, when you mentioned Surinamese Maroon culture, I was like, yes, this is going to be fascinating.
It's one of those stories
Yeah.
you know that you don't hear every day.
Right.
It's just incredible resilience.
Yeah.
Like forging this whole culture
Yep.
in the face of some really, really difficult history.
Absolutely. And we've got so much to dig into. Like, we've got historical accounts, linguistic studies, even some recent census data to kind of give us a picture of what's going on today.
Yeah.
So much to unpack, but maybe to start, for anyone who's not familiar, can you give us a little bit of background? Like, who are the Surinamese Maroons and what makes their story so unique?
Yeah, so picture this, right? Like the rainforest,
Okay.
the dense rainforest interior of Suriname.
Okay.
Really challenging environment to be in.
Yeah.
And scattered throughout this landscape are 6 distinct Maroon groups.
6.
6.
Okay.
And each one is associated with a specific river system.
Oh, wow.
So you have the Aluku, the Quinti, the Matawai, the Nguka, the Pamaka, and the Saramaka.
Okay, so it's almost like these different,
Yeah.
like their own little territory.
Yeah, their own little territories within this larger
Yeah.
landscape. And they face, I mean, obviously the rainforest itself is a challenge, but they face other threats too. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about escaping captivity, trying to build a new life in this really unforgiving environment.
Right.
And on top of that, you've got colonial powers who are
Still trying.
trying to recapture them. So it's a constant threat.
Wow.
But, and this is the amazing part, despite all of that,
Yeah.
they didn't just survive, they thrived.
Right.
They built communities, established trade networks,
Wow.
and most importantly, they held on to their cultural identity,
It's incredible.
which is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of cultural identity, their languages are fascinating.
Oh, tell me about it.
This blend of influences, right?
It's incredible. It's a true linguistic mosaic.
Yeah.
You've got English, Portuguese, Dutch, all mingling with African languages to create something totally new. Yeah, I was reading that it's such a small, like a fraction of the vocabulary is actually African origin, like 5 to 20%, I think is what I saw.
Right.
So how does such a small percentage have such a significant impact?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
It's not just about the words themselves.
Okay, tell you.
It's about how they're spoken.
Oh, okay.
Surinamese Maroon languages, they use something called meaning distinctive intonation.
Okay, I've heard of that.
So basically, the tone you use can change a word's meaning.
Oh, wow.
So for example, the word afi in Saramakan, it can mean cheap or it can mean stingy, depending on how you say it.
Wow, just in the tone.
Just in the tone.
Okay.
And this is a characteristic, this musicality of language.
Yeah.
This is a hallmark of many African languages.
Right.
And it's incredible how this has been preserved.
So even though the words themselves might not be there the way it's spoken,
Yes.
the actual sound of it still carries that.
That heritage.
Yeah. That's amazing.
It shows how deeply culture is woven into language. It's more than just vocabulary.
Yeah.
It's about the soul of a language.
It's like the rhythm of it.
And in this case, that soul reveals a really powerful connection to their African heritage.
Wow.
And, you know, speaking of connections,
Yeah.
that actually leads us nicely into their religion, Winty.
Okay, yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask you about next, because it seems like another really compelling example of this cultural fusion, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Winty is fascinating.
Yeah.
It really is, because you see this kind of tapestry woven from all these different African traditions,
Okay.
primarily from the Akan and Fon peoples. And what I find really interesting is that it was really suppressed
Yeah, I was going to say for like a century, right?
for almost a century.
Yeah.
And yet it's seen this resurgence,
Wow.
particularly among the Maroon diaspora.
So interesting how that survives, right?
And it's amazing.
You would think that after 100 years it'd be gone.
You think it'd be gone.
Yeah.
But it speaks volumes about how important this belief system is.
Right, yeah. To the Maroon people and how they've managed to keep it alive.
And I think what's interesting to me, too, is that, you know, we think about a lot of organized religions,
Mhm.
and they have a written text, right? Like they have some sort of central authority.
Right.
What does Winty have?
Winty doesn't have that.
Right.
It's all about oral tradition.
Wow.
So that knowledge, those rituals, those beliefs,
Yeah.
they're passed down through generations by word of mouth.
That's incredible.
which is amazing in and of itself.
It really is.
Because it speaks to the strength of their community
Right.
and their commitment to their heritage.
Yeah. And makes me wonder, did it have to change at all
That's a great question.
to survive that?
Yeah.
Like, were there compromises made?
Well, It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
Because so much of it is oral.
Of course. Yeah.
But I think it's safe to say that while specific practices might have been adapted or maybe veiled a little bit to avoid persecution.
Right, to make it.
The core of Winti.
That reverence for ancestors, the spirit world that endured.
Wow.
And it's fascinating because you see this blending with Christianity in some communities.
Right, because a large portion of them do identify as Christian now.
Exactly. And you'll find individuals who identify as Christian.
Yeah.
But they still engage in Winti practices.
Wow.
They acknowledge the spiritual world of their ancestors, but also the Christian God.
So it's almost like a layering?
It's like a spiritual layering.
Yeah.
Where different belief systems coexist.
Wow.
And I think it speaks to their complex history.
That's so interesting. And it makes you rethink. Like, I think often we think of these things as very separate.
Right.
It's one or the other. But it's not.
That's always the case.
It's not. It's much more fluid and complex than that.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about their history. We've talked about these incredible language, the resilience of their religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. Like, what does it all mean?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. Like, what can we learn? What can we take away from their experience?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that colonialism, while incredibly destructive,
Absolutely.
It couldn't erase the human spirit. Right. The Maroons, they carved out their own space. They preserved their heritage.
Yeah.
They forged something new and vibrant in the process.
Yeah, it's almost like a refusal to let go.
It really is. It's a testament to the power of resistance, adaptation, and holding on to who you are.
And I think you're right, because it does make you look at it differently, because so often we focus on, what was lost and the devastation, but they didn't just survive. They created something beautiful and unique.
Exactly.
And it's still going on today.
And it's still evolving.
Which is incredible.
So they really challenge that narrative of, the melting pot.
They really do.
Where everything just kind of blends into one thing.
It's not about erasure.
Yeah.
It's about fusion.
Yeah.
About taking those different threads and weaving them together to create something new and rich. It's almost like they took fragments of their past, the African traditions, European languages, even the landscape of Suriname itself.
Yeah.
And wove it into this vibrant tapestry.
It's beautiful.
It's uniquely theirs.
It really is beautiful.
It makes you think about, what else is out there?
Right.
Like, what other examples of this are there that we just, haven't even really scratched the surface of?
And I think that's the beauty of digging into these stories.
Yeah.
Because it opens up these whole new worlds.
Yeah, and it makes you realize how incredible people are.
Absolutely.
Like how resilient the human spirit is.
It's inspiring.
It really is. So for our listener who by now is like, I got to learn more.
Right.
Where would you even suggest they go from here?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I always think it's fascinating to look closer at the individual Maroon groups.
Okay.
Because each one
that makes sense.
Has its own story to tell.
Right.
They have their own traditions, their art forms, their ways of life.
So within this larger group, there's even more.
There's even more diversity.
Wow.
Yeah. So, for example, you've got the Aluku, who are known for their incredible wood carvings.
Right.
And then you have the Ninjuka, who have this rich tradition of oral storytelling.
Wow. So it's not even like a monolith. It's
not a monolith at all.
It's this constantly shifting.
It's dynamic. It's this amazing tapestry of all these different groups, each one contributing to this rich cultural heritage.
That's incredible. And it makes you realize, cultures aren't frozen in time, right?
Right. We're constantly living, breathing things. Right. They're evolving, adapting, finding new ways to thrive, even in the face of these huge challenges. And I think the story of the Surinamese Maroons embodies that perfectly.
It really does. This whole deep dive has been so fascinating.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, it really has made me think differently about a lot of things.
That's what we like to hear.
Yeah. And hopefully our listener feels the same way.
I hope so.
So to our listener, we hope this has sparked your curiosity.
Yes.
And maybe inspired you to learn even more about the incredible Surinamese Maroons.
Keep exploring.